The Mystery of the Pirate's Treasure, Chapter 12, Search in the Graveyard. Chris was up much earlier than usual the next morning. Mike looked up from his book to announce that Mom had already gone. Chris had been afraid that Mike was going to be reluctant about going to the graveyard with him, and he was right. "But it's broad, open daylight, Mike," he argued. "What can possibly happen to get us into trouble?" "I promised Mom I wouldn't do anything foolish again, and so did you," said Mike, returning to the book in his lap. "All we're going to do is see if we can find a tomb that has 3 brothers buried in it." "Yeah, I know, so you can go back tonight and rob it." "Mike, for the love of Pete, keep your voice down." Sometimes his younger brother was much too quick for Chris. "Okay, listen, why don't you go ask Nicole to go with us?" "You mean you're going to tell her?" "No, I'm not, and you better not either." "Well, she led you to look in the lining of that trunk, didn't she?" "What if she did? She didn't know what she was talking about, and she doesn't have to know this time." "It's just that, well, if you won't go without her, then go on and ask her." Still somewhat hesitant, Mike dragged himself away from his book and headed down toward the Kramer's apartment. Mike didn't have to know it, but Chris had in the back of his mind the idea of asking Nicole anyway. She'd surely know something of the cemeteries they had passed in the carriage yesterday. As Chris watched Mike and Nicole coming down the hallway, he tried to stifle a feeling that kept trying to emerge. At the beach, and then yesterday on the carriage ride, he'd found this girl to be a pretty regular fellow. He'd never cared for girls, and he didn't particularly like the way he was beginning to feel about this one. "Hey, Chris," said Nicole, "I didn't know you liked to walk in old graveyards. Dad and I do that often." Mike gave Chris one of his famous "I see right through you" stares. "Well," stammered Chris, "I hear the graves around Charleston are like the ones in New Orleans, above ground." "Some of them are, yes. Dad and I like to read the inscriptions on the tombs. Some of them are very sad." They went out in the bright sunlight and headed toward the churches when Chris asked, "Have you ever heard of more than one person being buried in the same tomb?" Again, Mike gave his brother a peculiar look, but Chris stepped behind Nicole and stared him down. "Oh, yes, sometimes when a mother and child died at the same time, they buried them together." "What about brothers?" "Well, I suppose they would. They had terrible epidemics, that wiped out whole families." One of the old churches with its tall spire jutted out into the street before them. There was a cemetery on either side of that church, and one on the left that ran into still another one. All of them were surrounded by fences that were a mixture of concrete, brick, and iron. Beyond that, Chris could see a church that looked like a tower from the days of King Arthur's knights. Great wisteria vines squeezed tall trees that grew close by. As a matter of fact, he'd never seen so many churches or graves. At that moment, finding the tomb of the 3 brothers seemed like looking for a needle in a haystack. For a long time they ambled around the graves. Some of the tombs were great monuments. Many of the older ones had pale lichen creeping over them. Chris had never seen anything quite like it. A few of the gray granite headstones were sunken. Even part of the inscriptions were buried. The one for which he searched wouldn't be that way, though. It would be above ground. It would have to be for the treasure to be there. It was all Chris could do to keep from racing around in an effort to find his grave. He had to take it easy, though, or he would give his mission away. Nicole stood fascinated by the angels and babies carved on some tombs, and that wasn't what Chris was looking for. Finally, they crossed the street and went into the oldest of all the graveyards. Here, the fig ivy clung to a concrete wall topped with iron spikes. Some crypts above ground were cracked. Others had pieces of concrete chipped away. An old man raked aimlessly about the graves. Little piles of browned leaves lay here and there. They passed graves of many persons famous in South Carolina history. Mike listened with interest as Nicole called his attention to different ones, but Chris's mind was on the one thing, finding the tomb of the 3 brothers. Many of the tombs were so old the inscriptions were illegible. Chris moved as quickly as he dared under the spread of gnarled magnolia trees shading the graves. Nearby, a beady-eyed squirrel scampered across the scrolled top of the imposing tomb and hopped into a sprawling magnolia. The leaves shook and a bird dropped. Again, Chris's eyes let his eyes play over the crypts. Maybe the treasure wouldn't be in a tomb at all. Maybe it would be like the scavenger hunt they had had at a church party, one place only giving a clue to another. Chris followed the worn path, crossing a section of the grounds. Suddenly he stopped in his track. There in front of him was a tomb with 3 names on it. He couldn't believe his eyes. The inscription was hard to read, but he could tell there were 3 names across the center. He could even make out their ages: 7, 4, 3. Forgetting everything else in his excitement, Chris began to form the words with his lips. Sons of Mr. and Mrs. But he couldn't figure it all out. But it said sons of. He was sure of that, and below those words were listed the long, full names of 3 boys. His hand actually shook as he touched the top of the tomb. It didn't look loose. The voices of Nicole and Mike jarred him. He would have to get his bearings to be sure exactly where the tomb was located. It would be hard to pick it out at night unless he was sure. He wanted Mike to know that he had found it, but he didn't want Nicole to know. He thought hard for a minute, and then he said, "Look, here's a grave that has more than 1 person buried in it. It has 3. He cast Mike a knowing glance. "It has 3 brothers." From Mike's surprised expression, Chris knew he'd gotten through to him. But Chris had no more time to think of that now. He had to plan. Eyeing some tall oak trees against a house bordering the cemetery, a brilliant idea flashed through Chris's mind. If only... But he'd have to get back to the theater to really map out his plans. Trying to picture it all in his mind, he walked back toward the other section where the gardener was raking. Nicole and Mike sauntered along behind. "Say," Chris approached the worker, "do they lock up these gates at night?" Before answering, the caretaker moved an arthritic hand to take off his hat and scratch his head. "Nah," he sighed. "It's never shut up less than they a fresh grave. And then sometimes they locks it to keep the flowers from getting stole." His gold front tooth flashed as he spoke. "Oh," said Chris, and he realized that Mike and Nicole were beside him. The sun was beaming down and catbirds called as they headed homeward, but Chris wasn't bothered by the heat. He was studying the roof lines of the houses along Church Street. It's hard to believe that with the exception of narrow Queen Street, the buildings joined one another all the way from the cemetery to Dock Street Theater. Chris sat and looked at the roof lines on their way to the cemetery, and now as they reached Queen Street, he was surprised to see workmen on a swinging catwalk across the narrow street. How had he missed seeing that when they came down? "Look," he said, much too enthusiastically. "Oh," said Nicole, "roof repairs are a common thing around Charleston. It takes a lot of work to keep those old houses up. Something's always being restored." "Gosh," said Mike, "I wouldn't want to work up there." "I would," said Chris. "I think it would be neat to walk over all these rooftops." Chris opened his mouth to say more when the thought struck him that his plans would be much safer if he kept them secret, at least for the time being.